Welcome and good afternoon, good morning, good night to everyone. So welcome to the second international conference on climate responsive urbanism organized by Sabancı University Istanbul Policy Center. My name is Ümit Şahin and I'm the coordinator of climate change studies at Istanbul Policy Center in Turkey, and I'm very happy to see a lot of friends around the world in this conference today. This is going to be the second climate responsive urbanism conference organized by IPC. The first one was in 2019, organized by one of our Mercator IPC fellows, Ender Peker, 2 years ago. And this year, this conference is organized by 3 of our Mercator IPC fellows, former fellows actually, Ender Peker again, Akgün İlhan, and Sinan Erensu. And you will see them just after this opening session during the panel discussions. They have their own speeches, and they are going to moderate the other panels. So I'm very happy to welcome Sarah Bell from Australia in this opening keynote speech. So welcome to this conference.
Thanks, Ümit.
Let me first start a very short, very brief introduction about IPC. Istanbul Policy Center is a research center under Sabancı University in Istanbul. And climate change is one of our research teams or areas. We call it cluster, climate change cluster actually. So in this cluster, we are doing several projects about climate change mitigation and adaptation issues. And also we have a fellowship program together with Stiftung Mercator from Germany. So this Mercator IPC fellowship program hosts every year several fellows around the world work about EU-Turkey relations and some other international relations topics, but as well as climate change. So, and this event is also one of the outcomes of this collaboration, because our Mercator IPC fellows are organizing this event. And urban issues in climate change, as you all very well know, is becoming more and more important and popular around the world. And especially water scarcity is becoming a huge problem due to climate change. And especially in Turkey also, it's becoming a more and more important problem, especially in the big cities. So in this second conference, the topic is chosen as water in cities. So we are going to talk about climate adaptation in urban setting around water issues. So, and it's really a global event today because we have guests from Australia to Mexico. So it's a quite large scale global event. And I'm not going to be very long, but just to introduce you our keynote speaker, Sarah Bell. Professor Sarah Bell joined, she's joining from Australia. She's now working in Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, starting this year as the City of Melbourne Chair in Urban Resilience and Innovation. Prior to this, she worked for 16 years at University College London as Professor of Environmental Engineering with the Bartlett School of Environment, Energy and Resources in UCL. Her research addresses community engagement with infrastructure with a particular interest in water. Sarah Bell is a leader in the field of urban water sustainability and is distinguished by her attention to the transdisciplinary nature of the challenge of sustainability. Her scholarly work draws on the social sciences to better understand how people, technologies, and nature interact to create urban systems. And her research investigates bottom-up community-based engagement in infrastructure provision and is informed by her expertise in urban water systems and her use of interdisciplinary research methods to explore and address intersecting issues within engineering, policy, and society. And her today's keynote speech is titled Climate Responsive Urban Water Systems, Community Water Management for a Livable London. And it's based on original work, I guess she has done in the UK. So before giving floor to Professor Bell, just to remind you that you can ask your questions by chat screen. This speech is going to be in two parts. So after the first part, we will get your questions right away, because the first part is more general about the resilience and adaptation issues in the urban setting, and the second part will be more about the case studies. So please, if you have any questions about the first part, you can directly write to the chat screen before the break, actually, and also during the break. Now, Professor Bell, I'll give you the floor, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Ümit. I'm very pleased to be here speaking to you from Melbourne, Australia. And as Australia is a settler colonial society still, it's important for me to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I speak to you from. They are the Wurundjeri people, and I give my respects to their elders, past and present, and their emerging leaders. So I will now share my screen. And yeah, so and the other thing that I need to acknowledge before I begin is that this work is very much the result of collaboration in both Melbourne, which will be, so the work I'm presenting in the first half of this presentation is really the outcome of work that's emerging with colleagues here in Melbourne at the University of Melbourne and the City of Melbourne. And then the case study is the outcome of collaborations with many people in London, including colleagues at UCL, Imperial College, the British Geological Survey, and residents and managers of the Leather Market JMB, who are a housing provider in London. Now, the purpose of my talk today is to illustrate how water systems can be assets for climate adaptation and resilience. And there's four main points to get across. The first four are, as Ümit said, more general and, linking back into some theory, which is probably very familiar to many of you. So hopefully there will be some interesting kind of points to discuss there. So we'll start with just looking at, again, something that probably everybody already knows, but what are the climate vulnerabilities of urban water systems? Then what do we mean by urban resilience? And I'm going to have a look at what I'm kind of calling the difference between reactive and adaptive climate responses. And then how can we move towards thinking about water systems as assets for climate responsive cities, moving from issues of water and climate vulnerability into this more broad urban agenda. Then, so I'm hoping that we'll have a break and some discussion around some of those ideas. And then I'm going to talk in detail about one case study that we worked on to illustrate some of these in London. And that's the project called Community Water Management for a Livable London. And then hopefully we'll still have some time to discuss the case study and anything else that comes to your mind after that. So in terms of climate vulnerability, there are very clear urban vulnerabilities to climate change, not least because that's where most of the people on the planet live, and it's also where most of our emissions originate from. And broadly, from a water perspective, the climate vulnerability or the vulnerabilities of the water system arise from both too much and not enough water, both in the cities and in their broader catchments and hinterlands. And so we experience that, you know, in the extremes, in extreme events, as both flooding and, you know, higher frequency and intensity of floods in cities and droughts. And again, higher intensity and frequency of droughts in many cities as a result of climate change now and into the future. But as well as those extreme events, there are underlying changes in annual average rainfalls, which furthermore exacerbate climate vulnerabilities. So many cities around the world are facing a drying climate at the same time as they are facing growing populations. So having to provide water and sanitation services to more people at exactly the same time as there's less water available. The climate vulnerabilities of cities do link into their hinterlands, so also impacts on food systems and competition for water between agricultural uses and cities is an increasing source of policy conflict. But cities are also facing other, you know, issues that might not immediately be thought of as being water related, but increased heat and increased urban heat island effects are issues that, as we'll see, the water, if we think about changing how we design and manage our water systems in cities, water might actually start to contribute to urban cooling and also even start to provide habitat for biodiversity in cities. So we both need to think in terms of climate vulnerability, we need to think both in terms of disaster risk reduction, how do we manage those floods, how do we manage in times of drought, but also how do we adapt to those underlying long-term changes. And resilience is a concept that comes up a lot when we start to think about how we respond to climate change and other shocks and stresses. And resilience is very broadly thought of in terms of bouncing back. And that in the history and the literature of resilience, there are many different definitions of resilience, but they broadly come from two main schools of thought. The first is the engineering concept of resilience, which is often about ensuring that systems are able to withstand disruption and recover back into their normal operation as quickly and as smoothly as possible. So an engineering definition of resilience might be about bouncing back. How quickly and effectively can a system bounce back to its original function? The more broad definitions of resilience come from what's called the socio-ecological framing of resilience. And they tend to talk more about how can resilience also be a process of transformation. So rather than bouncing back to the pre-existing state, how can resilience help systems to adapt and change and transform to an improved system? And we're seeing that in much of the discussion, if not the implementation of responses to the pandemic. You know, many governments and certainly many citizens are saying, actually, if and when we do bounce back from the pandemic, maybe we don't want to go back to where we were, maybe we want to bounce forward into a new normal, into ways of living that not only prevent future pandemics, but also help us to maintain some things like, you know, spending more time with our family, less time commuting, those sorts of things. So talking about resilience, we also talk about resilience responding to both these chronic stresses, the underlying conditions, underlying trends of change, such as drying, changing rainfall patterns, and acute shocks, those more intense floods, more extreme droughts, and then bushfires that we're certainly familiar with as an outcome of drought here in Australia. And as I said, there are many definitions of resilience in the literature. But one that's come out recently that is aligned with those ideas of socio-ecological resilience and bouncing forward is coming from UN Habitat. And their current definition is the ability of an urban system to maintain continuity through all shocks and stresses while positively adapting and transforming towards sustainability. And I think that's also indicating what has been perhaps in the last 10 or 15 years as resilience has emerged as a buzzword to compete with sustainability and sustainable development, is to really recognise that, you know, they are interlinked. And taking this transformative approach to resilience is not just about recovering systems back to their very unsustainable state, but using resilience thinking to improve sustainability. So some work that we've been doing with City of Melbourne is looking at various definitions and these relationships to sustainable development, and moving beyond definitions, what are the attributions or principles of urban resilience. Again, you will find many of these in different parts of the literature, and we're kind of working on an issues paper at the moment, which we hope to publish in the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute reasonably soon. But we're kind of settling on these 10 urban resilience attributes. The first is a more classic, perhaps related to engineering definitions of robust systems. Systems do at some point have to have some strength to be able to withstand shocks and stresses. Urban systems or urban resilience involves being prepared for those disasters and events, including being prepared for the unexpected. Spare capacity means that we need to, rather than thinking of making things as efficient as possible, is to always make sure that there's enough resources left over to be able to respond in times of change, and to keep those systems going. Resilience is also an inclusive concept, so we need to involve lots of different people in the conversations about what does resilience mean, who is resilience for, if we are talking about transformation, what does that look like? Resilience is reflective, it's learning from those experiences and learning from those different perspectives. Integrated refers to the need to look at interconnections between different urban systems and between the city and its broader hinterland and underlying ecological systems. Diversity refers to the need or the attribute, systems attribute that more diversity leads to greater resilience and greater adaptation capacity, and that's something that we've learnt from ecological systems. Flexibility somewhat counters the robust or classic kind of ideas of robustness, that our systems do need to be able to kind of bend and shift and change. Our systems need to be far-sighted in the sense that we need to be thinking strategically and for the long term, and of course to be innovative and be capable of experimenting with different forms of system, different forms of governance, different technologies. So thinking back to water systems and those vulnerabilities, particularly to water scarcity and also to flooding, is that many of our responses within water infrastructure tend to be what I would call reactive responses to improving resilience. So they are really focused on addressing urban water vulnerabilities and that bounce back or engineering kind of model of resilience. So really focused on making sure that water systems can recover from those shocks and stresses, And some of these classic responses, which are often engineering responses to an engineering kind of way of thinking of resilience, we see desalination plants as a means of really continuing our existing kind of infrastructure, but effectively expanding it or making it more robust, and doing it in a way that it's still very expert-led and still very capital intensive and still very centralised and highly controlled. And we can see this also in, building reservoirs or major flood defences or even basin transfers, effectively maintaining the existing model of infrastructure, but making it more robust, in some senses making it technically more flexible and technically more resilient, but perhaps missing some of those broader opportunities that a more socio-ecological definition of urban resilience enables. So if we think instead about adaptive responses to climate change and urban water systems, and this rather than focusing only on the vulnerability of urban water systems, is to start to think about urban water systems as assets in helping the broader urban environment and urban systems respond to climate change. So this might be more of those bounce forward, transformative socio-ecological ideas of resilience. And they very much involve partnership approaches, and they can't be delivered and met simply by urban water utilities or local governments or private companies. These are responses that need to be delivered in partnership, and they include approaches like water sensitive urban design or sustainable drainage, as it's called in the UK, low impact development, as it's called in the US. And it may include some decentralised water recycling. Now, it doesn't, rainwater harvesting, other things. It doesn't preclude engineering solutions like desalination, but it doesn't default to those kinds of engineering responses as a reaction to climate change. And these adaptive responses deliver many more benefits than simply a kind of robust, resilient water supply system. So this then leads us to really start to think about our urban water systems as assets for climate adaptability. So in order for cities to be responsive to climate change, we'll be looking at things like urban greening. How can our water systems also provide functions that serve as providing habitat for other species, providing cool spaces for people to spend their time in, contributing to alleviating the urban heat island effect through evapotranspiration and shading. And how can these approaches build community resilience, so that if communities are engaged in deciding how their urban water system or their open spaces should be managed for multiple benefits, then in fact they may be better prepared during times of stress or shock. So it's about thinking, how can our urban water systems help us to achieve some of those wider goals around livability, resilience, and sustainability? And if we think about it, it's, moving, how do we change some of the questions that we've been asking, from how can we make our water systems resilient to climate change, to how can our water systems contribute to climate responsive urbanism? And one of the things that was certainly an issue in the UK is that whenever often people who are water researchers, water professionals, even water policymakers, when faced with trying to bring communities and the public and even private sector into trying to think about how we might do our water work with water differently, a common refrain or a common cry was that people don't care about water because, particularly in comparison to, say, energy or climate change, these big policy issues, certainly in the UK, it's different around the world, but there was always this problem that nobody cares about water. And so, but I would start to, again, flip that around to start with what people actually do care about and how can we bring water in as part of that. So how can water help people to achieve their goals for their city and their neighbourhood? So lots of people might have goals for urban greening. They don't think of that as having anything to do with water, but urban greening projects can then, as we'll see in the case study, lead to improvements in water infrastructure. So we then, and bringing in a kind of partnership approach, how can we work together to achieve those broader urban goals and at the same time improve water resilience? So I am going to just take a little break there to see if anything's come up in the questions and to see what that has brought to mind.
As far as I see, there's no questions yet, but maybe there can be some questions. So if you have questions, all the participants, please write to the chat screen questions about the first part.
Or does anyone have any kind of, queries about alternate definitions of resilience that they work with, or does my...
There is one question exactly from Akgün, I guess. Maybe you can also see, but let me read it. Dear Sarah, particularly when it comes to water management, local and central governments have a dominant tendency to create reactive responses to water shortage and climate hazards, such as drought and flood. One example is from Istanbul. The local government has built a new system for collecting rainwater separately to avoid blocking sewage system and flooding during heavy rains. It all seems great, but the collected rainwater is neither stored nor transferred to the green area for irrigation. It is directly flushed to the sea. This is a typical example of techno-fixed engineering solutions in which only one problem is fixed at a time, whereas if the collected rainwater could be used for creating recreational ponds and green areas, it would help creating green open areas for people, strengthening urban biodiversity, and building resilience through nature-based solutions. So what do you think technocratic approach is so dominant in water management domain?
Yeah, I think that's a classic kind of scenario. I think that, one simple answer as to why the technocratic approach is so dominant is because it works, like it's been the dominant approach for 150 years or more, really, since, my profession, engineering, kind of emerged water and sanitation in cities like London was a foundation for the origins of civil engineering. And although it has been very uneven around the world, in a city like, where I am here in Melbourne, we do have clean drinking water that continues to flow even during droughts. We don't have major public health outbreaks associated with our water or sanitation system. So to some extent, it's a sign of the success of that approach. But I think also it's not, and there are, socio-technical scholars of infrastructure will point out that there's technical lock-in. Once you've got a system there, it's hard to change. But that system is not just about the pipes, it's also about the bureaucracy, the business models, the financing models, all of that lock in that way of looking at the world. So even when you get a chance, like you were just describing there in Istanbul, to actually build a new system, to build some new a new network with multiple benefits, because the entire kind of system around that is still in that 150-year kind of legacy of decision making, then it's the areas of change. So that kind of system of lock-in is a kind of social and policy lock-in and knowledge lock-in as much as it is a physical lock-in. So yeah, that's all. And then there are various kind of interests, companies that sell concrete and engineering firms that sell engineering expertise, and financial institutions that benefit from, the financing of those kinds of projects also are all kind of tied into existing models. So that all sounds quite depressing, but I think there are ways of changing that, and I think there are at all of those different levels. Yeah, in terms of why it's so hard to change, that's some of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important to raise this lock-in here, because we are very familiar with the carbon lock-in in the climate change discussions, for example. What I think it's very relevant to also talk about the water systems lock-in and other systems lock-in, probably in the urban areas, I guess. There are some other questions. Hakan Ozan Erzincanlı asks, are engines the main solution to engineering problems, or is it more of a system analysis?
Yeah, so I think engineers, there are different ways. I think good engineering does involve systems analysis, and systems engineering is in fact a very strong and powerful discipline. I think when we're talking about water infrastructure, I think one of the things to realize is that there really isn't a perfect technical solution, and all of the solutions, the kind of era when engineers almost anywhere in the world can deliver a solution that is sustainable, that is adaptable, that is resilient on their own, I think is long gone. There is no technical solution. So I think that is leading us towards more integrated systems kinds of responses and approaches that recognise the value of community engagement, the value of local knowledge, all of those kinds of things which aren't the traditional expertise of engineers. And in fact, a lot of this is coming from engineers themselves. So many engineers who, including, I guess, myself, who started out being very committed to technical solutions, engaged with sustainability, and then realised that there is no technology itself isn't going to solve all of our problems, and so then moving into more of this interdisciplinary space. So I think there's there are a lot of people and disciplines and research councils and consultancies really kind of moving in that direction.
Okay, Yonca Erkan has another question. Could you please also open up what can be learned from traditional water management systems in cities for resilience, learning from heritage?
Yeah, it's not my that's not my main area of expertise, but I think there's a huge amount, and there are we can learn about resilience, and then we can also learn about systems that weren't resilient as well. We can learn about collapse. And so I think, there's both building on traditional, like making the most of traditional knowledge that is still active and living in traditional communities and cultures that haven't been that have been excluded from the dominant technocratic kind of approach to making decisions about water in cities. And so here in Australia, it's a very slow process and very inadequate, but building on traditional owners' knowledge and values to understand how water moves through the landscape, what the history of that water is, the stories associated that tell us about water in this landscape is very important. And then also to there's a strong political battle there yet to be had, or certainly yet to be won, on actually giving traditional owners water to maintain their traditional practices and maintain their traditional cultures and improve the health and resilience of their own peoples. But I think almost in cities that have a longer heritage, you know, Indian cities that still have temple tanks that are being revitalised for rainwater harvesting and flood management. And then there's a huge amount that the discipline of archaeology has to teach us. I participated in a process led by archaeological colleagues a few years ago and contributed to to an edited collection there, and learning from ancient Chinese practices, and also continuing to question some of the stories that we tell ourselves about ancient systems and how they were managed. So yeah, huge amount, I think, to be learned.
Thank you. We have one more question, but maybe we can leave it to the last part.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea, just to be sure that we don't run short.
We will have only 20 minutes for the second part of presentation plus 20.
Okay.
So
okay,
you can continue.
Right. Right, so now we'll move on to our case study from the Community Water Management for a Liveable London, or Camellia Project. The Camellia Project was funded by the Natural Environment Research Council in the UK, not to do research, but to try and get the research that was done in universities and research institutes out into policy and practice. So there was a consortium of universities and the British Geological Survey who came up with this idea of focusing on integrated water management in London, and looking at how we might work together with all sorts of partners to bring the science that had been, and the research on the environment that had happened in universities and the British Geological Survey more into practice. So the vision for the Camellia Project, it's a large 5-year program, and it's about halfway through. And its vision is to enable water security for a livable city by facilitating a real participatory process through a systems approach based on environmental science. So that based on environmental science is really important, that this is something that is using good science, but using that in a way that enables a range of stakeholders to participate and is grounded in thinking through a systems approach, how all these things connect together. So there are lots of people involved in that program, and there's a list of them, and I mentioned some of them at the beginning as having contributed to this particular case study. And the approach is based on integration, as I mentioned. So the project is producing innovative tools to help support decision-making and analysis. It's working with a wide range of stakeholders, but it has citizens really at its heart. And then again, going to this point about what is actually important in cities, London, certainly prior to the pandemic, had a shortage of housing. So how do you work with developers to integrate these issues around water, as well as working with water systems and urban planning? So the project, certainly at its initial phases, was based on 4 main case studies. The first was working with Thames Water, who are the water utility in London, around helping them to resolve some of their very critical issues around their wastewater infrastructure, because there are very serious limitations on the future of that infrastructure, not least that London has a growing population, but there are no more sites to build more wastewater treatment plants. We can't expand wastewater treatment infrastructure. So what do they do about that? The next case study was in a place called Thamesmead in the southeast of London, and that's a site of major urban redevelopment, major house building. So working with big development opportunities to try and get these water issues integrated. Another case study was in the London Borough of Enfield, looking at urban flooding. And then the case study that I'm going to talk to you about today is working with residents on the Kipling estate in Southwark in London. And that's really based on their desire for urban greening and how do we move from urban greening into urban water infrastructure. So the Kipling estate is in a dense inner urban neighbourhood in London. Importantly, from the point of view of water infrastructure, it's serviced by combined sewers. So that means that water from surface water from runoff from roofs and roads goes into the same pipe as wastewater. So it sounds like that's the kind of situation that the project that was mentioned in Istanbul was trying to resolve. So those combined sewers serving most of inner London. And what that means is that during a heavy rainfall event, those sewers fill up and then they overflow into the River Thames, which is a major environmental problem for London. What you might call reactive solution to that has been to build a massive super sewer under the Thames to collect those overflows. And that project is currently under construction, but nonetheless, combined sewer overflows remain a major environmental problem in London, and doing anything we can to keep surface water out of those sewers is beneficial to the environment. The estate was built as a social housing estate. Like many in England, it's been partially privatised. So in terms of who lives there, mostly public housing tenants, public or social tenants. Some people own their own flats and some people rent from a private landlord. And the residents of that, so the project that we're talking about is on this grey concrete square here. This is a rooftop on top of some garages. So it's a 1-storey rooftop. It's about 40 metres by 40 metres. And it is linked to these 2 high-rise residential buildings, about 10, 12 stories tall. So when this estate was built, the idea, you can just see there that there's a, you can see that, so that's the concrete, these are the 2 buildings. You can see that there's some small walkways here. The idea was that people living in these flats would be able to use this as a recreational area. For various reasons in the years intervening, because these were built in the 1960s, this has become closed off to residents, and it's now just this very ugly open concrete space. So people living in these blocks looked down on that and thought, wouldn't it be nice to have a garden there? And started to kind of investigate whether that would be possible. They came to us as engineers because they realised that if they were going to have a garden there, they'd need to have some way to irrigate it, and they wanted to know if we had any ideas about how they might do that. When I went out onto that rooftop, I saw a massive water catchment area and realised that, as well as designing them a rainwater harvesting system for their garden, that if we could keep that much runoff out of those sewers, then that's a not insignificant benefit to the local environment. So we integrated this into the Camellia Project, and the purpose from our point of view was to develop and test tools to co-design water infrastructure as part of that garden. So this project had a kind of quite conventional three stages workshop structure with various activities happening in between and various tools kind of developed in between the workshops. So the first workshop involved, first of all, an infrastructure safari where groups of local resident experts and technical experts went out and looked at the local neighbourhood, looked at where water flows, which car parks flood when there's a heavy rainfall, where does the water supply come from, and so forth. And we ran a game which brought out what people valued and what they were opposed to. People were most wanted to see some growing opportunities and biodiversity habitat in their garden, but they were most opposed to having open access to the general public to be able to use this garden. And then that in particular had implications for the kinds of funding that would be available to build the garden. In our second workshop, we demonstrated to the residents the concept of attenuation using very sophisticated means of a few baking trays and some tea towels. We did discuss funding options of what different designs and purposes of the garden would mean different funding models are available. And then we worked with these cardboard models and played some games to come up with a kind of outline of what a garden might look like that might also solve some of these water infrastructure issues. Then in our final workshop, in between times, we had installed one rainwater harvesting unit so that people could understand how it worked. So we went to have a look at that. We went back up onto the roof and had, because the main activity in this workshop was to use a piece of software, which I'll show you in a moment, a calculator design tool. So we wanted to make sure, so it was a scaled model in a piece of software. We just went up to the roof to make sure that people had an idea of what a grid square in the computer actually looked like on the roof. And this came to a sort of final outline design. And one of the main tools that we produced for this was what we called the Kipling calculator. There's further versions of this have since evolved. And this is essentially a kind of drag and drop model. So residents could take an element of green roof and drop it on a grid square, or raised beds for growing flowers or vegetables. These tanks to provide the water supply, some social space or sheds or other things. And what the software did behind the scenes was calculated based on how many raised beds they'd put, how much water they would need. And then it also calculated how much the runoff would be reduced. So particularly if they were looking at different models of funding based on attenuating stormwater and improving the local environment, then maximising this number would make the case clearer to some funders. So what we learnt through this process of co-designing infrastructure, there was one of the things that it meant was that it opened up spaces that might not otherwise be available to water managers to be able to reduce that runoff. So when residents came to us wanting to build a garden, we were then able to build in water infrastructure ideas into that. And then that helped to deliver these multiple benefits that we keep talking about for resilience and sustainability. So just to sum up my kind of thoughts or main points about this idea of climate responsive urban water systems is, for as much as possible, to move towards adapting away from reacting and start to think about urban water systems not just as systems that are vulnerable to climate change, but systems that are assets to help achieve wider goals of urban resilience. And when we're talking about climate responsiveness, we need to think about responsive to people and communities, and to create these solutions through partnerships. So I'll just leave it there and see how we're going with the questions.
Thank you, Sarah. We have 5-6 more minutes for questions. We had one remaining question from the first part. You can read it, but because we are recording that I think I should read it. Sinan Erensu is asking that I would like to hear what Sarah thinks of some of the critics of the idea of resilience, such as the idea that it may strengthen an assumption that any socio-ecological system would eventually bounce back from disruption and degradation. How is resilience lit responding to such critics? What are the ways in which resilience talk and policies does not necessarily put the responsibility on local innovation and ingenuity?
Yeah, there are lots of problems with resilience as a concept, and I think you're pointing to a few of them there. You know, and there are classic, because, you know, the main criticism is that it seems to, particularly talking about community resilience, is that it's like an abdication of, oh, well, you know, government doesn't have to do anything now. We don't have to take responsibility when things go wrong. We'll just sort of assume that people are resilient and they'll bounce back of their own accord at some point. And, you know, there are classic kind of placards of communities suffering from various or continued disasters saying, please don't call me resilient. And so I think in terms of why, you know, why I've not given up on the concept is that I think that broader socio-ecological view of inclusivity, so if you're kind of covering all of those attributes, I think it is trying to address some of those critiques, and you know, there are many sad stories about the effectiveness of governments responding to the pandemic, but I think here in Australia, at least, where we have been very lucky so far, it is that there is a kind of renewed respect for the role of the state in responding to disasters. So yes, I think making sure that those who are in power actually are taking responsibility to deliver resilience, rather than just saying that, oh, well, we'll just kind of leave it to people to figure it out themselves, or, you know, undertake minimal interventions and hope that that systems bounce back. And I think also the other, like that new UN Habitat definition, recognising that it is also about transformation and sustainability. Because one of my own concerns with resilience has been actually many of the systems that we currently have, we don't want them to be resilient. You know, the fossil fuel sector is remarkably resilient, and that's a problem. So there are systems that we want to see disappear, and we want to see our energy system transform. So it's about resilience in transforming towards sustainability. So it's always important to ask resilience of what and for whom, as well as resilience to what. So often people just get stuck on the to what bit, resilient to floods or fire or what have you, without thinking, what are we being resilient for? And how, yeah.
Okay, there was one direct question. Actually, when you were talking in the second part, Hakan Ozan Erzincanlı was asking about the workshop 2. Is it like a kind of risk analysis?
We did include some risk assessment in there. You know, that's very important from my point of view as an engineer, making sure that whatever we did was safe is a fundamental concern. It was more than it's more about so in the first workshop, people really said, this is what we want, this is what we don't want. The second workshop was really actually about creating stories about how they were going to get there. So I didn't have a chance to go into the details of the tools and the games that we played in that workshop, but one of them is called Landed, which is like it's almost like a backcasting idea of, you say, all right, this is where we're at, and then what's the story about how we got there. So those were the kind of games that we were playing with Lego figures and, you know, cut out pictures and so forth. So yeah, in terms of the design process, it's about that. I guess you would say the first is about outlining basic requirements. The second is about identifying some options. So there were people working in different groups to come up with different scenarios and different options. And then the third one is the more kind of detailed, heading closer towards a detailed outline design.
Okay, this is the last question because we are almost out of time. So Ender is asking, and Peke is asking, looking from a socio-technical perspective, the Camellia project highlights the value of community integration to generate breaking points in the way water systems are designed and operated in urban environments. It seems like such kind of innovative attempts call for a leader or a leading group. I wonder, how do you see the role of non-governmental actors in terms of triggering changes in the conventional practices at local governments? Could you please share your experiences in terms of initiating and convincing all actors involving in this project?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point about leadership. So one of the main kind of philosophies of the Camellia Project, and we talked about this a lot when we were putting together the funding proposal, was when the classic idea of integrated water systems is that we all end up with some perfect catchment management system, and particularly an engineering system. We have these computer models and we can do it efficiently, allocate resources, but that's never going to happen. Certainly not going to happen in London. It's never going to happen in any city that's complex, because you've got so many different layers of governance and actors and so forth. And so in some ways, taking this more bottom-up approach is a way of subverting that. So I think there's a huge role for non-governmental actors, but it has to be done you can't do anything without the main water utility. The good news is, certainly in cities like London and Melbourne and, you know, many around the world, those big utilities are realising that they can't do it on their own. So Thames Water, for instance, around their wastewater treatment plants, said, well, what can we do? We can't do, there's no more land, we can't build any more wastewater treatment plants. We have to go and talk to people and figure out solutions. So yeah, I think there are examples, particularly from cities in the US. Portland is one that stands out, Philadelphia, where a strong figure leading within the government, kind of water, local government, has been able to deliver incredible outcomes. But I think more commonly it is, going to be lots of different people doing lots of different things, building lots of different relationships that is probably going to achieve this kind of change, rather than waiting for a big government pronouncement or some, you know, big seismic shift from the top.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. So Sarah Bell from University of Melbourne, our keynote speaker, and thank you very much for this.
Yeah, so my pleasure. I am going to leave you now because it is now 10:30 p.m. and it's Friday night.
Okay.
My week is over. So I'm very sorry that I won't be able to continue to participate, but I wish you all the best for the rest of the conference and conversations.
Thanks a lot.